it's not essential for a branch of science to explain why the phenomenon is there in the first place. Physics, the overall enterprise of physics, incredible explanatory power about the universe, completely doesn't tell us why there's a universe in the first place to explain. We often set a higher bar for consciousness than we do for other things, partly because we are conscious. We want that intuitive aha, like, oh, that makes sense. There's absolutely no reason why a scientific account of consciousness should be intuitively satisfying. It would be nice if it were, but that's not strictly necessary. I want to understand what it is like to be me better. What does it mean to be a self in the world? The way I've been going about this is by trying to draw parallels between the way the brain constructs experiences of the world and the way the brain constructs experiences of the self. So rather than the self as being this inner observer of an external world, no, the self is a perceptual construction too.
Welcome to Brain Science, the podcast where we explore how recent discoveries are helping unravel the mystery of how our brains make us human. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell, and this is episode 188. Today's guest is Anil Seth, author of the fascinating new book, Being You, A New Science of Consciousness. But before I tell you about that, I want to remind you that you can get more episodes of Brain Science, complete show notes, and episode transcripts at brainsciencepodcast.com. And of course, you can subscribe for free wherever you listen to audio. Brain Science is produced independently and relies on the financial support of listeners like you. To learn more, please visit brainsciencepodcast.com/donations. Please feel free to send me feedback at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. We also have a Facebook fan page. You can get show notes automatically each month by subscribing to our free newsletter. Just text Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. That's Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. There's also a link on the webpage. I'm really excited about today's guest, Anil Seth, because he is part of the new generation of neuroscientists who are exploring the neuroscience of consciousness. It's no longer career suicide to explore consciousness, and it's very interesting to see how he has built on the pioneering work of his mentors. If you are a new listener, this is a great place to start, and no matter how long you've been listening, I hope you will share this episode with others. I'll be back after the interview to review the key ideas and to share a few brief announcements, including an exciting announcement about next month's guest. Anil Seth, welcome to Brain Science.
Thank you, Ginger. It's a pleasure to be here.
Consciousness has been one of my favorite topics ever since I started Brain Science back in 2006. And I've had the privilege of talking to many of your colleagues, including one of your mentors, Chris Frith. So I'm glad we're finally getting a chance to talk. And of course, we're going to talk about your new book. But before we do you mind taking a few minutes to tell us a little bit about your own personal journey?
Sure. I, like you, have always been interested in consciousness. I trace my own interest in the subject back to when I was a kid. It seemed to be one of those things that when you're just coming into the world, you start to think about all these big things. Who am I? What happens when I die? What is free will? These deep questions that often get beaten out of us as we get educated into other more useful things. And that to some extent happened to me too. I was interested in these big questions, consciousness, self, will, but didn't really plan to have a career academically researching consciousness. I didn't know that such a thing existed, and indeed such a thing didn't really exist at the time that I was going to school, and even during my undergraduate. I did my undergraduate degree in the early 90s. I started out studying physics at Cambridge, partly because at that time it seemed like physics was it's the queen of sciences. If there was going to be an answer to such a fundamental question as consciousness, I thought in those days, my teenage days, all right, it's going to come through physics. Then that seemed to be less plausible, partly because, frankly and honestly, physics got a little bit too hard for me. I hit a wall in my ability to solve these really complicated equations in about the second year. And then I discovered that I could also study psychology. And at Cambridge, when you're studying sciences, you're not allowed to specialize until the third year. So I was able to continue a bit with physics while also beginning to study experimental psychology. And for me, this was fascinating. It was a different way of thinking. It seemed to get much closer to questions about the brain, perception, mind, and consciousness than this very indirect way through physics. I thought, how long is it going to take me to get to the cutting edge here? And it also involved a different set of skills. It involved writing and thinking conceptually in a different way, which I found quite appealing. But still, consciousness was outside of the arena of topics that we were thinking about. Most of my teachers and mentors in psychology at the time, I later discovered, were the sort of leading lights of British behaviorism. So they really prioritized animal learning theory. People like Nicholas Mackintosh and Anthony Dickinson, absolutely seminal figures in 20th century psychology, but not really the kind of people who would encourage a dedicated and specific interest in the neuroscience of consciousness. That was still considered at the time, at least as far as I could see things, to be the remit of philosophy or sort of more outlandish proposals from physics. Like I read Roger Penrose's Emperor's New Mind, and frankly, that almost put me off for good. I mean, he's a brilliant mathematician and a brilliant scientist, and I've had the privilege to meet him now. But at the tender age of 19, trying to make sense of this book, which claimed to propose a quantum mechanical explanation for consciousness, just didn't seem to me to be the right way to go. And I thought, if that's what it's about, then I'm out of here. And in fact, my PhD also ended up being kind of a diversion. I studied computer science and artificial intelligence at the University of Sussex, which is actually where I am now as a faculty. And I did that because at the end of my psychology degree, I was quite dissatisfied with not just the inattention to consciousness, but the general kind of explanations that were being proposed in neuropsychology and cognitive science. These were things very much like box and arrow models. You'd have all these boxes with labels in, like executive control system, long-term memory, short-term memory, and so on, and then arrows that were supposed to denote information flow between these things. And sometimes these descriptions are incredibly useful. I remember the power of box and arrow models to distinguish different kinds of dyslexia was really striking. But still, there seemed to be something unsatisfying. The brain is not boxes and arrows, and we didn't study neuroanatomy very much, but there was clearly something missing. And at that time, in the mid-90s, there was some activity in AI about the power of neural networks to control robots. And we could begin to do things like apply genetic algorithms to neural networks, to evolve these networks to control systems in ways that seemed semi-biological. And I got really interested in these kinds of approaches. Again, consciousness was a little bit outside, but I was learning here about many different ways to think about complex systems in general and biological systems in particular, how they are embodied in bodies, how they are embedded in environments, how to think of dynamical interactions without necessarily thinking in terms of like static mental representations held inside heads somewhere. So all this I now see as laying the groundwork for how I would later start to think about consciousness. Even during the PhD, I was still fascinated by it, still wanted to work on it, but I didn't really see a way. And it was only when I moved for my postdoc to San Diego to work with Gerald Edelman that things changed. And Edelman was one of these people, I think many of your listeners might know of him. He was one of these people who won his Nobel Prize very early in life. And then because he had already got his Nobel Prize, he was able to go and spend his time thinking about consciousness and other things. Francis Crick is the other great example of one of the pioneers who cashed in their Nobel to follow this track. Actually, both of them ended up in San Diego. So that was really the place to go. And when I got there, I realized there were so many other fascinating people there, like Christoph Koch, who was working with Crick on the neural correlates of consciousness approach. And suddenly there, it became part of what I was talking about every day, and started to think now that, in fact, this could be something that I could actually do. And so I think I was rather lucky because I embarked on my academic career when I finally got a faculty job in now about 2007, 15 years ago or so. It was just about the time that it was no longer career suicide for a very junior faculty to say they were interested in consciousness and even to begin to write a grant application that included consciousness as part of it. That was just fortune. I was lucky to get in at a time where I could get some training and begin to build up a research group which was explicitly interested in studying consciousness and doing it through what would be quite a standard cognitive neuroscience approach, not coming up with dramatic, radical new theories of the physical nature of the universe, but saying, well, how can we understand how complex networks in the brain and body generate and shape and construct our perceptual experiences of the world and the self? And in a sense, that's just a kind of alternative perspective on a lot of what was already going on in cognitive neuroscience. But it's a change of perspective that makes a difference. If you keep consciousness in the crosshairs, you ask different questions and you do different experiments and you bring together different disciplines in different ways. And I think that's the one thing that stayed with me, that last point, that the study of consciousness is an intrinsically interdisciplinary endeavor. Most things are really, frankly, disciplines of these artificial constructions that we bottle ourselves into. But consciousness in particular, I think to make progress, you need to address it from philosophical, from physical, from biological, from computational perspectives. And what I've tried to do over the years is be quite fluid about the different methods and approaches that we try to creatively combine to ask and answer questions about consciousness.
When did you work with Chris Frith? Was that when you were a postdoc or later?
Oh, we never actually worked together. So Chris Frith I got to know when I moved back to Sussex. So I did my PhD at Sussex, was in San Diego for about 7 years with Edelman, moved back, and University of Sussex, for those of you who don't know much about it, why should you? It's in Brighton, which is on the south coast of England, and it's very close to London. It's like a lot of people commute to London and back. And so working in Brighton, at least in pre-pandemic times, we were up and down to London all the time. Chris Frith is based at UCL. And so I got to know him through just the general academic environment in Southern England. And his ideas on, that I'm sure we'll get to, on the brain as a prediction machine really resonated with me. And definitely his work is one of the major influences in how I came to think.
So that's a picture of Brighton in the background behind you, the beach.
It's actually a picture of Shoreham. It's very close to Brighton, but yeah, I can look out my window and see much the same thing. Since I'm stuck in the office, it's nice to have it in the rear view mirror. It's a beautiful city.
I've been to London once, but I've never been anywhere else in England. But I of course, do know that Brighton is the place with the beach. That's what it's famous for, right?
It's the stony beach. We've got people sometimes come and complain because we don't have sand, but I always say the benefit of having pebbles or stones on the beach is you don't get them all over your house when you come back. And culturally, it's a lovely place. I mean, people often call it London by the sea, and it's very vibrant. And right now in summer, it's been great to be able to go for a swim in the morning before settling into the home office.
How would you say your approach to the neuroscience of consciousness compares to some of the other popular approaches? What sets it apart? What does it have in common with these?
Yeah, that's a good and difficult question to answer comprehensively because I won't answer it comprehensively. Perhaps distinctive things about my approach to consciousness is that I've been rather reluctant to go all in on one big theory that claims to explain everything. I think it might be because we're a little bit early days for that kind of thing. So I've been very interested and influenced by a number of the predominant theories of consciousness. These are things like global workspace theory, which proposes that consciousness is instantiated in networks of communication in frontal and parietal regions of the brain. Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory, which proposes that has a sufficient basis in patterns of integrated information in the brain. And that theory has interesting roots in work that Tononi did with Edelman, which originally actually attracted me to work in San Diego. So there are lots of different approaches, but I think my approach is more of a methodological claim. When people talk about consciousness, they often talk in terms of David Chalmers' famous distinction between the hard problem of consciousness and the so-called easy problems. And I'm sure your listeners are familiar, but just to rehearse this distinction, the hard problem is supposed to capture the mysteriousness and intractability of a scientific account of consciousness. It's the idea that we all know that conscious experiences relate to physical systems such as brains in intimate ways, but we have no good idea why and how physical processing should give rise to subjective experience at all. Chalmers says it seems unreasonable that it should, and yet it does. The hard problem is capturing the intuition that no explanation constructed in terms of mechanisms will ever be up to the job of explaining why and how consciousness comes to be part of the universe in which we live. This is indeed a very challenging problem. It's a really difficult problem to solve. But I also don't think it's the most useful problem to go at directly. Neither is the only alternative simply to focus on the easy problems. And the easy problems are all the problems about the brain and the body that don't involve consciousness. How does the brain work in ways that can, at least in principle, be accounted for in terms of mechanisms? Like, we don't have any in principle conceptual feeling of, oh no, it can't happen, when we think of like, how can we explain perception in terms of mechanisms? How can we explain action selection in terms of mechanisms? We don't know what the solution will be, but there's no seeming impossibility of constructing an explanation given some sufficiently complicated mechanism. If you divide things this way, and of course this division goes back way prior to Chalmers, it goes back to Descartes, it goes back to Galileo, as far back as you want. The choices seem to be either try to understand how consciousness happens at all, or forget about it and sweep it under the carpet. I think there's a really productive middle way, and many people follow this middle way. It's certainly not my invention, and I've called it, partly to have a friendly dig at Dave Chalmers, I've called it the real problem of consciousness. This is the challenge of accounting for properties of conscious experiences in terms of underlying mechanisms without necessarily trying to account for the existence of consciousness in the first place, but with a focus on the phenomenological properties of consciousness. And by phenomenological properties, I really mean how they appear in subjective experience. So what I'm looking for instance, is an explanation of why the experience of redness is the particular way it is and not some other way. Why it's different to blueness, but both redness and blueness are more similar to each other than, let's say, an experience of toothache or of jealousy. Why an experience of emotion has a valence but not a sense of spatial location. There are lots of things we can say about conscious experiences that help us understand what shapes them, when they come about, without us having to go after the big kahuna problem of what is it about physical processing that makes it so that there is consciousness in the first place.
So it's kind of like we're asking how instead of why?
I think we're asking how and why as well. We can ask, why is an experience of redness the way it is? What, in the sense of what function is it serving for the organism, both in the moment and over evolutionary time? It's more that we're not asking the metaphysical question of how is it even possible that physical interactions can give rise to a subjective experience. Now, for many people, bracketing that question just means I'm not really doing consciousness science, right? I'm ignoring the elephant in the room here. But I don't think that's a fair criticism. I think that we can make, and this is my promissory bet, that we can make enormous progress if we try to explain, predict, and control phenomenological properties of consciousness in terms of their underlying mechanisms. And the reason I think this is the best bet is that this is typically what we ask of other branches of science. It's not essential for a branch of science to explain why the phenomenon is there in the first place. Physics, the overall enterprise of physics, incredible explanatory power about the universe, completely doesn't tell us why there's a universe in the first place to explain. We often set a higher bar for consciousness than we do for other things, partly because we are conscious. We want that intuitive aha, like, oh, that makes sense. There's absolutely no reason why a scientific account of consciousness should be intuitively satisfying. It would be nice if it were, but that's not strictly necessary. I mean, I hope that it is. It would be much better that it is. Added to that, there are plenty of examples where taking this kind of pragmatic, real problem approach ends up dissolving the mystery indirectly rather than solving it by going after it directly. The analogy I always use here, recognizing that it is an imperfect analogy, is how scientists come to understand life, how the history of our understanding of life developed. It wasn't that long ago that vitalism was very dominant. People thought that the property of being alive could never be explained in terms of any kind of mechanism. You needed some special source, some élan vital. And of course, people don't think that way. We don't understand everything about life, but there is no longer a conceptual mystery that life is explicable in terms of mechanisms. Strategically, that shift depended on biologists of the day moving away from thinking of life as one big scary mystery in search of a big eureka solution to describing and accounting for the properties of living systems somewhat separately, reproduction, homeostasis, and so on. And the hard problem of life was never solved. It was just dissolved. Now, there's no guarantee that the hard problem of consciousness will fully dissolve. There may be residues of the hard problem that remain. I don't know. But I do believe that following the real problem approach is the best way to go. And even if we don't completely solve the hard problem, maybe our explanations will bottom out somewhere, we'll get a lot further than trying to address the hard problem head on and ignoring all the rich possible space of explanations that we can empirically get at that connect properties of conscious experience to properties of the brain and the body.
So let's start with the really basic question. What is your definition of consciousness?
It is very simple. I start with Thomas Nagel's definition, the famous philosopher, consciousness being the presence of any kind of subjective experience whatsoever. Nagel said, for a conscious organism, there is something it is like to be that organism. There is something it's like to be me, to be you, to be a bat, as Nagel argued in his famous article, but probably nothing it is like to be a table or a chair or an iPhone. Although some people disagree about iPhones. And that's the fundamental definition. I honestly don't think you need more than that, because there's again this slight, people think that the first task in consciousness science is we have to have an exhaustive and consensus definition before we can even get going. But of course, history of science doesn't work that way. Definitions always evolve along with scientific insight. So starting from that definition and taking a real problem perspective, for me, the next step is to try and disambiguate a few different aspects of consciousness beyond this idea that it's any kind of subjective experience. And this is kind of more of a heuristic, practical approach rather than I'm arguing for a series of definitions that have real ontological bite. The way I like to divide up consciousness is in terms of level, content, and self. So level, conscious level, is simply understood as this difference between dreamless sleep and wakeful awareness, with things like vegetative state and general anesthesia, dreaming, drowsiness. These can all be thought of as variations of conscious level. It's not just a one-dimensional thing, but you can think of it, at least to begin with, in that way. And then conscious content is what you are conscious of when you are conscious. Whenever you're conscious, there is a conscious scene that is populated by different kinds of contents. I have visual experiences of things around me. I have auditory experiences of things around me. I have emotional experiences of things within me. All of these things are parts of our conscious content. And a particularly important subset of that is conscious self. And here I think we go right back to where we started, which is, what's the motivation for thinking about consciousness? Often it's, I want to understand what it is like to be me better. What does it mean to be a self in the world? The way I've been going about this is by trying to draw parallels between the way the brain constructs experiences of the world and the way the brain constructs experiences of the self. So rather than the self as being this inner observer of an external world, no, the self is a perceptual construction too. It's a perceptual construction that appears as part of our conscious contents. So those are the three ways that I like to parcel out consciousness and think of them as related, but pragmatically we can think about them in separate experimental programs.
want to take a moment to thank TextExpander for continuing to sponsor Brain Science. I love having them as a sponsor because I literally use TextExpander every day. With TextExpander, you can create snippets for any content you want to reuse, which is an incredible way to reduce keyboard fatigue. Best of all, it's available on all platforms, including iOS, iPad, Android, and Windows, so you can use it on every device. To get 20% off your first year, go to textexpander.com/podcast to learn more. And don't forget to tell them that you heard about it on Brain Science. Okay, so why don't we talk a little bit more about perception, because that seems to be like the meat of the discussion, especially in your book. You want to talk about why understanding perception tells us so much about consciousness? Because I think it really does.
Sure, I'm happy to. I should just say that the book is organized in this rough way. So I go through level and content and self and then talk about the implications. But we can move on to perception because that's really where I have most to say, I think. And here, indeed, there's a phrase which I first heard from Chris Frith, which is this idea that perception is a controlled hallucination. And this phrase resonated with me, and I've continued to use it over the years. The idea here is that perception is not some kind of passive readout, bottom up, outside in readout of an external world. It's always and everywhere a top down interpretation, an act of construction. I know one of your previous guests, Yuri Buzaki, talks about the brain from the inside out. I think this kind of concept is absolutely key. There's a sense in which intuitively we think about perception as this sort of outside in, bottom up process. And in fact, a lot of vision science is constructed implicitly on these sorts of foundations. We have a good understanding that as you go deeper into the brain, starting at the sensory surfaces, the retina, and so on, neurons in different areas pick out increasingly abstract and complex features of visual scenes. Early stages pick out things like changes in luminance and so on, and later stages pick out whole objects, faces, cars, wing mirrors, wheels, and so on. And so it's tempting to think that perception is this sort of just picking out and then putting together features of different levels of complexity. But the problem is that this is really it's both not sufficient for how perception actually might work in practice, because sensory signals are simply too noisy and ambiguous to specify the contents of what we perceive. And it also doesn't really map onto what we know about how the brain does this. And this is not a new insight. Again, it really goes back to Plato, to von Helmholtz in the 19th century. He was the first to formalize this idea of perception as inference. His proposal was that what we perceive, the contents of our perception, are the result of a lot of under the hood neuronal best guessing about the most likely causes of sensory data. So the brain is always trying to figure out what could have caused the data that it gets. And it's that best guess that forms the content of our perception. Another slightly more formal way to say this is that perception is a process of approximate Bayesian inference on the causes of sensory data. The brain is taking in data and trying to figure out the most likely cause. Bayesian inference is this sort of idea that you reason backwards from effect to their most likely causes rather than forwards from causes to their most likely effects. More recently, this idea has become repopularized by things like predictive coding, predictive processing, free energy principle, active inference. All these different ideas have in common the notion that the brain is achieving some kind of approximate Bayesian inference through this process of minimizing prediction errors. So what's actually happening in perception is that the brain is continually calibrating its best guesses about the causes of sensory data against evidence from the world. And this is a real inversion of the way we typically think of perception, because now the content of what we perceive isn't carried by the sensory signals. The sensory signals that stream into the brain are, to a first approximation, error signals. Their main job is to update the top-down perceptual predictions. And it's the collective ensemble of top-down predictions that constitutes what we perceive. And I find this line of thinking really attractive. It provides a very nice convergence of philosophy when we think about, back to Kant now, that what we never have direct access to what's actually there in the real world, even though there's stuff really there in the real world. Buses exist whether or not you're looking at them, but that our perceptual content is always an active interpretation. It's always structured by a priori expectations encoded in the brain. And it provides a really nice way to think about the relationship between what we experience and what's there. So, for instance, when we perceptually experience color, we know that colors are not an objective property of the outside world. We've known that since Newton. Colors require a brain to exist. Colors are made from mixtures of wavelengths. The artist Cézanne, I think, said color is the place where the brain and the universe meet. I think it's a lovely way of putting it. When we see a particular color, like I'm looking out of my window now and it's a sunny day, so I can see a blue sky in Brighton. In a sense, that's both more than what's really out there and less than what's really out there. It's less than because the cells in my retina are only sensitive to 3 wavelengths of the electromagnetic spectrum. So this is a thin slice of reality that is able to shape my perceptual experience. But from those wavelengths, my brain can generate an almost probably actually infinite variety of different colors. So that's more than what's actually out there. So this is, I think, a lesson that can be generalized to all our conscious experiences. It's not that we perceive less than the world or that everything is hallucinated. No, our brain constructs perceptual contents as the most useful, not necessarily the most accurate, but the most useful way in which sensory data can be used to guide our behavior.
So, how does this discovery that perception's the brain's best guess relate to the hard problem?
Well, I think it only indirectly. And here I think it does go via what I've been calling the real problem. One way to address this is to return for a second. It's a little sidebar, but I think it will get us where we want to go. A long empirical tradition in consciousness research has been about looking for the so-called neural correlates of consciousness. Now, this was a notion introduced by Francis Crick and Christoph Koch in 1989, 1990, something like that, really as a way of getting consciousness science up and running. Here's something you can do. You can have a situation like binocular rivalry, where your sensory input is the same, but you're showing a different image to each eye, like a house to one eye and a face to another eye. And your perceptual experience alternates between the two. So your sensory data is rivalrous in this sense, hence binocular rivalry. And in a situation like this, you can ask, well, what in the brain changes along with your conscious experience? And that constitutes a way of examining the neural correlate of consciousness, because the sensory data hasn't changed. All that's changing is your conscious experience. And so this has been a very rich experimental paradigm. But of course, the criticism always is that correlation is not explanation or causation. If I tell you that your parietal cortex is part of the neural correlates of perceptual consciousness, well, that doesn't tell me why I'm experiencing my visual scene in the particular way I'm experiencing it. It's just a correlation between brain regions and different kinds of experience. Now, this idea of predictive perception, I think, can be thought of as generalizing this approach to go beyond mere neural correlates towards what we might call explanatory correlates, correlations that can do a richer job of explaining why that conscious experience is the way it is and not some other way. This is, for me anyway, the research program of the future that we're just really starting now. How can we use the resources, conceptual, mathematical, experimental, of something like predictive processing to understand why different experiences are the way they are? And I'll just give you one taster example of how this might play out. If I pick up an object in front of me, like I'm picking up a book. I'm picking up my book because I have it here for reference, so I can remind myself what I think. I perceive it as having a back, even though I'm not directly sensorially exposed to the back. The book is a three-dimensional object. I perceive it as being a three-dimensional object, even though I only see part of it. How does that happen? Now, again, a long while ago, people like Gibson in ecological psychology, but also Kevin O'Regan and Alvin Noe, talked about things like sensory motor contingencies. We see a three-dimensional object as being three-dimensional because our brain somehow encodes knowledge about how it would respond to various actions. If I rotate the book, I will see the back. It's that sort of implicit knowledge of how actions change sensory data that underpins the perceptual experience of, in this case, the book as having a back. Now, you can cash this out, and this is something I started thinking about in the first paper I put out on this was about in 2014, connecting that idea to predictive coding and saying that mechanistically what's going on in the brain is that we perceive something as having objecthood when our brain encodes a rich range of conditional predictions about the sensory consequences of different actions. This way, you can begin to understand why different kinds of predictions can lead to different kinds of experiences. And for instance, understand why some perceptual experiences don't have a sense of three-dimensional objectness about them. If I have an after image, if I stare at the sun for a second, it's experienced not as a three-dimensional object in the world, but as a glitch in my experience, because there's no predictions about the sensory consequences of actions. If you move your eyes around, the after image goes with you. So that would be one example of how to build a bridge. And we can do experiments this way. We've done stuff in my lab with my former postdoc, Keisuke Suzuki, building virtual reality environments containing objects where we can vary how they respond to our actions. And then we can assess how that affects how we experience those objects. And sure, this is not a solution to the hard problem, right? But it's trying to get not just that. I think the important thing here is I'm not just saying which of two competing perceptions happens to be dominant at a time, as in something like binocular rivalry, but why a whole variety and class of perceptual experience is the way it is. I think that gets us closer to building in phenomenology, the nature of experience, what a first-person experience is like, building in phenomenology to our scientific story about consciousness.
The next level that you talk about in the book is the idea of self, and you're really going to now apply those same tools and perspectives. Are we ready to talk about that a little bit, or do you feel like we need more background information?
No, I think that's good because it does follow pretty smoothly from what we've just been talking about. Here, there's just another slight but significant conceptual reorganization that goes on. And again, none of this is new to what I've been saying. It's all there in the history of thinking about these things. The self is not the thing that does the perceiving. The self is itself a kind of perception. What does this mean? Well, firstly, it's a way of trying to diffuse this intuition that there's a little homunculus inside my head that is the recipient of all this sensory data, reads it out. That kind of assumption that would go along with this thinking of perception as a bottom-up process of reading stuff out, right? These two assumptions tend to go together. So if you've got rid of one, we think of perception as a kind of active construction. It's the brain that's doing this active construction. There doesn't have to be a mini me inside my head that is making these constructions and looking at them from inside. No, our experience of selfhood is a kind of perceptual experience. It's a complex experience. It's composed of many different parts. And I experience, on very low levels, I experience myself as having a particular body, this object in the world that is part of me, whereas other things like the chair I'm sitting on is not part of me. At the very lowest level, and I think we'll get there, there's simply the experience of being a living organism without any discernible shape or form, but just this basic sense of being alive. It's very difficult to describe, but I think that's the lowest level of experienced selfhood, of sentience. And then there are higher levels of selfhood as well. There's the experience of perceiving the world from a first-person perspective. There's the experience of agency and of intention, things that we typically draw under the label of free will, which is another rabbit hole. Free will is a kind of perception. It's not a causal agent in the world. And then at the highest levels, we experience ourselves as having a trans-temporal identity. Like I am the same person in some way that I was this morning and yesterday, and even maybe 5 years ago and 5 years hence. I think we overestimate our trans-temporal continuity a bit. I don't think I am the same person to the extent that I feel that I might be. But nonetheless, it's stable enough that I can put a name to it, which is my name, and I can have memories. And there is a thread that links these experiences over time. And then part of that thread is shaped by being in a social network. And for me, that's the highest aspect of our experiences of self, the highest just in terms of the furthest removed from the interior of our body, where part of what it is to experience being me is how I infer how others perceive me. Part of my self-perception is refracted through the perceived minds of others. That can play out differently for different people, but we are all partly constituted by our social and cultural environments. This is kind of a rich theory of selfhood, that it's certainly not a single essence, an essence of unus that might survive death of the body and all sorts of other unlikely consequences. But there is an evolving bundle of perceptions. Hume called it bundle theory. There's an evolving bundle of conceptions that at any moment in time defines what it is to be you, and understanding how all that happens is the challenge of understanding self-perception. And the brain faces a very similar problem, even when it comes to the body. Just as the brain only has indirect access to what's out there in the world, it only has indirect access, slightly more direct, but it still relies on sensory signals to make sense of what's going on inside the body. We call this interoception as compared to exteroception. The idea is that this process of best guessing, of the brain making its approximate Bayesian inference about the causes of sensory signals, applies just as much to self-related sensory signals as to sensory signals coming from the world around me.
I want to take a moment to remind you about my book, Are You Sure? The Unconscious Origins of Certainty. I released an updated second edition last June, and thanks to listeners like you, it went to #1 under new releases in neuroscience on Amazon. Are You Sure is available both as an ebook and as a paperback from all the major online sellers. But I would love to send you an autographed copy. Just email me at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com to learn more. What about the role of embodiment? You've kind of alluded to it, but could you expound on it a little bit more?
Yeah, the body emerges as key in this story, and it emerges as key in a couple of different ways. The role of the body, I think, has been neglected in typical psychology, cognitive science, for a variety of reasons, some of them quite good reasons. If you want to do rigorous experiments on perception, you usually have to constrain the environment people are in to minimize the impact of them moving around, of their being embodied and embedded in an environment. But in our natural behavior, we're interacting with our environment all the time. We perceive things through our bodies. So there's one sense in which it's the physical interactions between our body as an object and the wider world. Those interactions significantly shape all our conscious experiences. This, again, is the kind of thing that Gibson talked about with his ecological psychology. I perceive a door as something that can be opened. I perceive a knife as something that could be used in the act of cutting. I perceive a ball flying through the air in terms of not where it is in space, but in terms of its catchability. This idea of embodied interactions is really important to understand the phenomenology of perceptual experience. Things appear to us in our experience differently because of the way their causes interact with our physical bodies. So that's one way embodiment is important. The second way is, I think, for me, the more interesting, which is the body as an object itself, as the object of perception. So here's probably the final conceptual reorganization that I go on in the book, which is, so the first one was that we don't see things as they are. Perception comes from the top down, not the bottom up. The second one is the self is a perception, not the thing that does the perceiving. And then the final thing is to understand perception, especially perception of the body, as not primarily in the business of finding out what's there. This is a bias we get when we think about vision, which may often be about that. But it's about control and regulation. So the primary purpose of a brain is not to solve crosswords or do neuroscience. It's not even really for talk. The primary purpose of a brain, here where Chris Frith might disagree with me about this, but I think the primary purpose of a brain is to keep the body alive. And everything else follows from that. Even the ability to control movement follows from a more fundamental imperative to keep the body alive. So when the brain is perceiving the internal states of its own body things like blood pressure and heart rate and oxygen content of the blood, things like that. It's not that we need to know what they are, it's that we need to regulate and control them to keep them within tight bounds compatible with our continued physiological viability. And it turns out that predictive models that are geared towards generating predictions and that can be updated by prediction errors, are very good ways of controlling systems. And this is a lesson that comes from engineering. It comes from this whole branch of computer science and engineering called cybernetics. We think about simple controllers like feedback mechanisms that take an error signal and use it to modulate a control signal. Central heating systems work that way, right? It's too hot, you turn the AC on. It's too cold, you turn it off, turn the heating on. Our brains can be thought of as massively updated central heating control systems in this sense, because they not only react to the current state of the body, they anticipate its future needs. And the only way to do that is to have a predictive model of how the overall situation of the organism, what's going on in our environment, what's going on in the body, how that's likely to affect our physiological viability. There's a word in biology called allostasis, sort of stability over time rather than stability in the moment. And so the fundamental role of the brain then is to develop and deploy predictive regulation of the body itself. And what's the perceptual content? In the same way that if my brain is developing and deploying predictions about the causes of sensory signals, I have a visual, from the eyes, I have a visual experience. But if the brain is deploying predictions that are geared towards controlling the interior of the body itself, I'm not going to have a visual experience. I'm going to have an emotional experience, or at the very deepest levels, I'm going to have an experience of just being a living organism, where the experience of selfhood completely bottoms out. There's no objecthood, in the same way that we were talking earlier that my book has a sense of being a three-dimensional object. At its lowest levels, the sense of being alive doesn't have that at all, because predictive models that are geared towards control don't care about whether my liver actually has three-dimensional shape or not. It cares about how well it's doing in regulating my prospects of continuing to stay alive. This is fundamental. And the largest claim that I make in the book, and this is an agenda rather than a firm conclusion based on lots of evidence, is that from this starting point, everything else follows. So given that brains evolved and developed for the primary purpose of physiological regulation, that is the way we understand all of our perceptual experience. We experience the world around us and ourselves within it, with, through, and because of our living bodies. You cannot understand consciousness except in light of our nature as a living system. I think that's a conclusion that I wasn't expecting to reach, but it's a conclusion that emerged as I followed this line of thinking about perception all the way into the depths of the body itself.
You call this the beast machine? Is that right? Beast machine theory of consciousness? Have I got that right?
Got it absolutely right. Yeah. It's a bit of a dig at Descartes again. Poor Descartes, he takes a lot of crap these days. But as well as dividing the world into mind stuff and matter stuff, he also had some strong beliefs about animal consciousness, non-human animal consciousness. For Descartes, non-human animals, he called them beast machines, or bête machine in the French, flesh and blood robots that did not benefit from the kinds of conscious rational minds that we humans had. I think it's often a bit overstated. People sometimes say that Descartes thought that animals were not conscious at all. It's unlikely he actually thought that. He was using different conceptual terms for all these things. But nevertheless, he did describe non-human animals as beast machines. The distinction is, of course, that we humans, we have conscious minds in spite of the fact that we are also beast machines. The flesh and blood materiality of us is not relevant to us having these godlike rational conscious minds. After Descartes, there was another philosopher, thinker, scientist of the time, Julien Lamettrie, who extended Descartes' argument. He came up with this idea of l'homme machine or man machine. And so his conclusion was, well, if animals are merely beast machines, then humans are animals too, so we must also be flesh and blood robots. It was unclear to me, at least, what conclusions Lamettrie was really trying to draw from, besides just provocatively taking Descartes' arguments to their rational extreme. But I was sort of motivated by this. I remember reading this history and thinking, that's absolutely right. we completely invert Descartes' view here and come to the conclusion that instead of human consciousness being something that is relatively independent of our flesh and blood living materiality, we are conscious in virtue of it because we are beast machines, that we have conscious experiences. This is, again, an idea that I'm indebted to a number of my colleagues for pursuing it from different angles. I know you talked to Mark Soames recently, who has some similar ideas. Lisa Barrett does, Antonio Damasio does. There's been a wealth of people who've increasingly put out there these strong connections between regulation of living processes and conscious selfhood and conscious experience. And so I see my arguments as part of that wider landscape. I'm also not saying that only living things can be conscious or all living things can be conscious. What I'm saying here is that we can only understand consciousness from the perspective of thinking of conscious systems as living systems. So it's a slightly weaker claim than other people might make.
You brought up an interesting question that emerges several times in the book, which was the fundamental question is whether consciousness is more like temperature or more like life. Could you expand on why you think that's an important question?
Yeah, this was a theme that emerged partly through the writing of the book, which is actually one of the nice things about writing the book. There are many things about writing a book which are not very nice at all, mainly the fact that you have to do it. But one of the nice consequences is that themes crystallize during the process. And one of them was this distinction between two kinds of scientific stories, the story of heat and the story of life. And the story of heat was this example of what you might think of as really successful reductionism. You had this property of something being hot. It turns out that the property of something being hot or cold or whatever is identical to something else. It turns out to be absolutely identical to the mean molecular kinetic energy of the molecules or atoms inside the substance that is hot or cold. That is what heat is. Key to reaching that insight was the ability to make measurements, the ability to repeatedly make comparable measurements of the temperature of systems was absolutely essential in driving this new thermodynamic understanding of what heat actually consists in. And it wasn't an easy thing to do. I read this remarkable book by the historian of science called Hasok Chang called Inventing Temperature, which tells the story of all the controversies and difficulties that scientists of today faced in developing reliable thermometers. I mean, how do you do it until you know what heat is? How do you design a reliable thermometer if you don't have fixed points? What do you do? But those problems were solved over time, and now we understand really what heat is, and it is this other thing. And this is great because we can generalize. We can talk about the temperature at the surface of the sun, and we have an absolute zero, kinds of things that we have no direct personal experience of. Life is different. Life doesn't come down to one thing that is identical to something else. It's a collection of properties that are instantiated to varying degrees. There are gray areas. There are things like viruses, oil droplets, which share some of the properties of living systems, but not all of them. It's a constellation concept. But nonetheless, we understand it. And we understand it by recognizing that it, in fact, is not one thing, it's many things. So it's very, very different from how our understanding of heat developed. So the question is, what's consciousness like? Is it more like temperature or is it more like life? Now, if you're guided by something like the hard problem, this overarching question of what it is that magics experience out of mere mechanism, you might be tempted to think that consciousness is something like heat. It is actually something else. So some prominent theories exemplify this perspective. The integrated information theory of consciousness from Giulio Tononi exemplifies this. Consciousness is local maxima of irreducible integrated information. You can put a number to it. Ideally, the endpoint of at least part of that program of research would be to come up with a thermometer for consciousness. And this is great. It may turn out like that. I personally not sure it will, but it's a legitimate line of research to follow. The alternative perspective, and the one that the real problem of consciousness fits better with, is that consciousness is indeed something more like life, that it comprises many different properties that may instantiate in different ways among different people, among different species, but the story that we will eventually tell that naturalizes consciousness will be more like the story that we've already told that naturalizes life.
I just really liked that way of looking at things. It brings me all the way back to when I talked to Evan Thompson years ago. When I read his book, Mind in Life, I was like, yeah. And it's Carl Friston's work is a more complicated version of the same idea, right? You get a separation, something that makes this a separate from the rest of the world, and subjective behavior comes along with for the ride. It's kind of the way I look at it. And to me, that makes the hard problem dissolve.
Yeah, I think that's the promise. So Evan Thompson's certainly another of my major inspirations over the years, and actually for two different reasons. His connection, his strong articulation of links between life and mind. He was definitely at the vanguard of that. But also his work with Francisco Varela on neurophenomenology, which is actually very similar to what I'm proposing with this real problem approach to consciousness. Neurophenomenology for Varela was the project of explaining, connecting phenomenological properties to their neural mechanisms. Varela tragically died a long 20 years ago now. And one of the things I often think about is, what would he be doing now had he lived? He made so many contributions so rapidly. So yes, Thompson definitely. There are lots of historical roots for these ways of thinking, and then Carl Friston's stuff is fascinating and frustrating by sometimes equal measure. So I've known Carl for quite a long time, and we actually first got to know each other during a friendly disagreement about methods of measuring causality from neuroimaging data. But since then, I've been following and in some small ways with my colleagues here, hopefully contributing a little bit to these ideas about the free energy principle. It is complicated mathematically, and indeed, I have to tell a small story here was that I first heard about it in 2007, and I went to a summer school where Carl was supposed to be speaking. In fact, he was speaking. I was late, so I didn't hear his seminar, and then he'd already left by the time I got there. And when I got there, seemed like everybody else was just massively confused about what he'd been talking about. And so I thought we'll have to dig into this some more. And with a couple of my colleagues at Sussex, Chris Buckley and a visiting scholar, Chang-Sub Kim, we decided to try to rederive and rewrite the free energy principle from first principles. And we thought this should be a fairly easy thing to do, but it eventually we started it in 2009 and published it in 2017. It took a very, very long time, about 8 years longer than expected. But I'm glad we went to the trouble, because the free energy principle is still evolving. It's a principle. It's not a specific theory. It's a way of thinking about things. It provides a mathematical apparatus that indeed connects things like self-organization at a very low level to things like predictive generative models that might underpin perceptual inference. It's unclear exactly how it works. There are some assumptions made on the way of some of the articulations of the free energy principle that might either limit or in fact make more general its applicability. But already there are some things that fall out of the mathematical apparatus that we have. One of them is that when I talked about minimizing prediction error, so there's a whole framework of predictive processing. It's often thought about as like sensory data carries a prediction error, and we want to minimize that. And when we've explained all the prediction error away, that's what we perceive. You can make some equivalences between prediction error and free energy, and those strengthen this whole connection between life and mind, because it basically says that for a system to continue existing, it has to minimize free energy over time in the long run. And that turns out to be, again, under some assumptions, equivalent to minimizing sensory prediction error. So there's one way of deriving the whole apparatus of the predictive brain from a basic premise about what it is for a system to keep on existing. And then one of the further things that falls out about this is it turns out that if I want to minimize free energy in the long run, free energy, by the way, I wouldn't worry too much about the term here. It just comes from the sort of equivalence between thermodynamics and statistical mechanics. That's sort of undergirds a lot of this stuff. It turns out that I need to minimize prediction errors also in the future, and in free energy terms, expected free energy, not just free energy in the here and now. And I think, again, this provides a really interesting way to think about how different kinds of predictions may explain different kinds of experiences. What would it mean for my experience to minimize a prediction error about how actions might affect something in the future? It's not clear there's a good answer to that, but it's a way of recognizing that we can go so much further than just thinking about correlations between this or that region of the brain and this or that perceptual experience. We can do a lot better than that, and all these things help us on the way.
Today's episode is sponsored by HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit. Every week you have 50 recipes to choose from, and they are constantly changing. Right now they're featuring special fall recipes, and you may actually save money because you get fresh, pre-measured ingredients with nothing wasted. And you save time. I first discovered HelloFresh over 5 years ago when I was visiting my sister Diane. She is also a busy physician, but we had great fun doing the meal prep together and discovering new foods we had never tasted. I'll never forget discovering that parsnips can make a great French fry substitute. Green Chef is now owned by HelloFresh, and with a wider array of meal plans to choose from, there's something for everyone. And now you too can enjoy both brands at a discount with me. Just go to hellofresh.com/14ginger and use the code 14ginger. That's 14 GINGER for up to 14 free meals, including free shipping. That's hellofresh.com/14ginger, and the code is 14ginger. And now, what else would you like to share before we close?
Thank you for asking. I mean, I'm reluctant to try and read the whole or explain the whole book in this podcast. Of course, that's not going to work. But I just want to mention two things, and this is where I get to at the end of the book, which are implications for non-human animals and implications for what's often called machine consciousness. So when it comes to non-human animals, of course, humans are animals too. When we think about consciousness in terms of this primordial drive to stay alive, rather than complex cognitive machinations of one sort or another, that may lead us to widen the circle of conscious experiences among other species, attribute it a bit more generally. It doesn't solve the practical problem of how do we know, because we're still severely constrained by what other species can report behaviorally about what's going on in their minds, which is severely limiting. But just recognizing that consciousness is tied closely to life, and that conscious contents either are built from or at least substantially shaped by predictive perceptions, can begin to give us a handle on what the conscious experiences of other species might indeed be like. So I talk a bit in the book about octopuses. It's become very popular to talk about octopuses these days. But for good reason. They're fascinating examples of very different morphologies, shapes of creature, different perceptual apparatus. We can't directly experience what it's like to be an octopus, but we can begin to understand it from a third-person perspective, and I think that's super interesting and all we can reasonably expect. And then the final thing is this idea of machine consciousness, which also is very current at the moment, partly because of the perceived rapid advance in artificial intelligence. I don't think that advance is quite as rapid as people sometimes think it is, but it certainly led to this idea that AI will, at some point, and maybe quite soon, reach a threshold at which it either takes over the world, bootstraps itself beyond our comprehension and control, and possibly also become conscious, maybe all at the same time. This is sort of a bit of a caricature of the singularity hypothesis from Ray Kurzweil. But I don't buy into this kind of inevitability at all. One of the lessons that comes from thinking about the beast machine theory is that the more closely you tie consciousness to life, the more distinct it becomes from something like intelligence. And so intelligence certainly might be key to particular kinds of consciousness. I can regret things I haven't even done yet, anticipatory regret. I have to have the cognitive competence to have that specific experience. But being conscious of basic pain, pleasure, disgust, that's not going to require all that much intelligence at all. So consciousness is not going to just come along for the ride as we build smarter and smarter artificial systems. That, I think, is just, there's no reason to think that it would. And by a similar token, many people still assume that functionalism is correct, or the default assumption about consciousness. And by functionalism here, I mean the idea that consciousness is substrate independent, that it doesn't matter what a system is made out of, It matters what it does. And so this is the idea that if you program a computer in the right way and it's sufficiently powerful, it will become conscious. You've given it the magic algorithm, and hey presto, it has experiences. Functionalism is super interesting. I just don't see it as obviously false or obviously true. And I'm being annoyingly ambiguous about this, on the fence. But it could be that consciousness turns out to be something that is substrate independent. Some things aren't. Computers that play Go are actually playing Go. But some things aren't. When it's raining, wetness happens. But when you do a simulation of a weather system in a weather forecasting computer, it doesn't get wet and windy inside the computer. Weather is not substrate independent. So is consciousness dependent on the material that our brains are made of? It may be, but it may not be. And if you want to think, well, which is more likely, given that we can't make a definitive call, then this connection between life and consciousness suggests that it may indeed be substrate dependent. Because where do you draw the line? Where is the distinction between hardware and software in a living system? It's really hard to know. That clean separation just doesn't apply. It's wetware all the way down. Again, my inspiration for this way of thinking was Evan Thompson, and in particular Humberto Maturana, who talked about autopoiesis, something that links really tightly with the free energy principle. This idea that self-regulation is a process that goes all the way down. So the way I see it, it might be life rather than intelligence that breathes fire into the equations of consciousness.
That sounds reasonable to me. So I'm going to ask you the final question I ask all my guests: advice for students interested in neuroscience.
Two things. Don't lose sight of the big picture that you're interested in. It's easy to get sidetracked by what might seem feasible or possible. You should be mindful of these things in the short term, but I'd advise to keep in front of mind why you're in this business in the first place. What is it that you want to understand? What is it that you want to know? It doesn't have to be consciousness. There are many other fascinating problems in neuroscience out there. What is memory? How does perception work? Things like that you can ask. And having this big picture still there will just lead you to do the right kinds of things at the right time. But don't expect it to all happen at once. You're not going to find the ideal job, lab, whatever it is. It's going to come together from a sequence of, it's a journey. My own trajectory went through many different things. I didn't really know where I would end up. And I've been lucky too, and I completely concede that. But it's helped not to lose track of the big picture. At the same time, methods. Don't let them dominate, but learn methods, especially from a more pragmatic, how to get a successful career perspective. Having command of innovative, sophisticated methods is absolutely invaluable. But at some point, you have to use those methods. My old mentor, Joel Edelman, he told me it once. He said, at some point, you have to stop polishing your spectacles and look through them. And he was right. So it's a balance between these two things. And if you have that balance, of course, there's nothing that's going to guarantee everything's going to turn out. But those things, those perspectives, I think, will help.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me today. I'm looking forward to sharing this with my listeners and sharing your book with everybody.
Ginger, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you for talking. It's been a delightful discussion.
First, I want to thank Anil Seth for taking the time to talk with me. We actually recorded this interview before Being You was published, so depending on where you live and when you're listening, it may not yet be available. As I record these words, it has just been released in the UK and is scheduled for release in the United States on October 12, 2021. If you're interested in consciousness, this is a must-read, whether you've just started or you've read extensively on the topic. Putting the question of consciousness to the side for just a minute, I want to emphasize an important point Anil made about doing science. First, he reminded us that it's not about having extensive, detailed definitions for every term, but more importantly, it's not about asking the ultimate why questions. For example, physicists can't tell us why the universe exists, even though they have impressive evidence for how it formed and when. Similarly, looking for the mechanisms of consciousness is not the same thing as answering the partially existential question of why it arose. Sure, we can speculate that consciousness gives animals a survival advantage, but that is speculation. So just as he did in his book, Seth starts out in the interview giving us an overview of the so-called hard problem of consciousness as contrasted with the easy problem. He takes a position that I think is quite pragmatic. He's not looking for a theory that explains everything. Instead, he's trying to tackle what he calls the real problem of consciousness, which is determining the brain mechanisms of subjective experience. He gives consciousness this very straightforward definition: subjective experience. And then by focusing on mechanism, he is able to break the problem down into scientifically manageable pieces. He starts with three basic aspects of consciousness: level, content, and self. In the book, he goes into more detail about experiments that are designed to explore these three key aspects. And one of the things he has in the book that I don't want to forget to mention is description of a lot of virtual reality experiments and how they relate to his conclusions. So I encourage you to read that if you're interested in it. There are several key points that I took away from this interview. The brain's key function is prediction. The goal of prediction is guiding action so that we can survive. Consciousness is therefore a tool for survival. The importance of prediction leads to the second key idea. Perception is a top-down phenomenon. The brain constantly predicts how its sensory inputs will change in response to whatever action it has initiated. This has several big implications, but the most important is probably the fact that it means that perception and consciousness are not about accuracy. They're about interacting with the world in a way that keeps us alive. What does this have to do with consciousness? The aspect of consciousness that most of us really care about is the self. How does the brain generate this sense of selfhood, along with the qualities such as agency and continuity? Seth makes a somewhat startling but simple claim. He says that the self is a form of perception. Now, if you're new to brain science, this may be hard to believe, but it actually fits with what a lot of previous guests have said, though perhaps in a more indirect way. It is a simple but elegant solution to the question of who is doing the perceiving, since it removes the need for an homunculus or inner observer. A key idea is that perception is not about finding out what's really out there. It's about control and regulation. As Seth said, the primary purpose of the brain is to keep the body alive, and everything else follows from that. Anil Seth's beast machine theory of consciousness is not a theory in the sense of the other popular theories that he mentioned. It's more of a description of how he approaches the real problem of consciousness. Whatever the mechanisms of consciousness are, they are clearly intimately connected to our animal bodies. There is no scientific reason to restrict consciousness to humans, even if we can't obtain verbal reports from non-human animals. One of the most fascinating aspects of Seth's book came out briefly during our conversation, and this was the idea that consciousness is intimately connected to life. This contrasts with some other approaches that presume that the key feature of consciousness is intelligence. Jeff Hawkins, who has a deep interest in understanding how the human cortex produces human intelligence, has been very explicit in saying that he is not trying to understand consciousness. This is a critical point when considering the possibility of the emergence or creation of non-living consciousness. This interview was full of nuggets, but it still only scratches the surface of Anil's wonderful new book, Being You, A New Science of Consciousness, which I recommend to everyone. There are a few other things you should know about the book. It has an excellent discussion of integrated information theory, including both its strengths and weaknesses. There's also a brief introduction to the importance of Carl Friston's work, which was mentioned by Mark Solms recently. There's a good overall introduction to the neuroscience of consciousness without excessive detail about the numerous competing theories. This is one reason why I think it's a great place to start if you're new to the topic, but you will enjoy it no matter what your background. Of course, I would love to hear what you think about this episode or anything else. You can send me email at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. I want to encourage you to visit brainsciencepodcast.com for detailed show notes, episode transcripts, and as well as links to related episodes. While you're there, please sign up for the free newsletter so you can get show notes automatically each month. You can also sign up for the newsletter by texting Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. That's Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. I want to thank those of you who support the show via premium subscriptions, Patreon, and direct donations. Since Brain Science is independently produced, your financial support is essential. If you want to learn more, please visit brainsciencepodcast.com/donations. And on the subject of premium, during the conversation, we talked about Chris Frith, who's been on Brain Science way, way long ago. And that is a premium episode, but you can get it for free this month if you look in the extras in the free Brain Science mobile app. I want to give a shout out to Mel from Australia, who is creating short video snippets of Brain Science episodes. You can find these on the Brain Science Podcast YouTube channel. I would love to hear what you think of these snippets, and I hope you will share them with others. Since Brain Science launched back in 2006, one of the most requested guests has been Antonio Damasio. If all goes as planned, Dr. Damasio will be coming on next month's episode of Brain Science to talk about his upcoming book, Feeling and Knowing. Of course, back in 2009, I announced he was coming on and it fell through, so I'm kind of scared about announcing it, but I have a scheduled interview slot with him and I'm hopeful. Until then, I hope you will check out my other podcasts, Books and Ideas and Graying Rainbows. Thanks again for listening. I look forward to talking with you again next month. Brain Science is copyright 2021 to Virginia Campbell, MD. You may copy it to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. The theme music for Brain Science is Mind Fire, written and performed by Tony Catraccia. You can find his work at syncopationnow.com.